Ireland has always been a place full of conflict and toil. One such struggle was the effort to gain independence from the British Empire during the early 20th century. Deep hatred of England had been brewing for more than a century before the 1900s. In post-famine Ireland, anti-English hostility was adopted into the philosophy of the Irish nationalist movement. At the turn of the 20th century, anti-English themes appeared in national organizations that said they were promoting native Irish values. One such group was Sinn Féin, which eventually came to represent the political side of the push for Irish Home Rule. By the early 1900s, the fight for Home Rule became known as the Irish Parliamentary Party. It came to dominate Irish politics. An idea built around independence and rebellion had consumed the hearts of the Irish people, and they were ready to fight for it. The tension that had been building up for the past decade culminated in the Easter Rising during April of 1916. During Easter, a small group of 1,500 rebels belonging to the Irish Citizen Army and the Irish Volunteers staged a rebellion in Dublin. Early on Easter Monday morning, the rebels, led by Patrick Pearse and James Connolly, took over strongpoints in Dublin city centre and created their headquarters at the General Post Office. After occupying the post office, the volunteers hoisted 2 Republican flags, and Pearse read a proclamation of the Republic. Irish men and Irish women, we declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland, and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. The British military were caught totally unprepared by the rebellion. From Tuesday to Saturday, martial law was declared on the city. British forces were initially focused on securing Dublin Castle and isolating what they believed to be the rebel headquarters at Liberty Hall. By the end of the week, British strength stood at over 16,000 men. On the morning of April 26th, British reinforcements were caught in the crossfire while trying to cross the Grand Canal at Mount Street. A mere 17 volunteers were able to kill or wound 240 British soldiers. The volunteers, on the other hand, only lost 4 men. After days of shelling, the men inside the GPO were eventually forced to abandon their headquarters. On April 29th, after realizing that they could not break out of the building without further loss of civilians, Pearse issued an order for all the rebels to lay down their arms. The government and the Irish media wrongly blamed Sinn Féin for the rebellion, even though it had not been involved. Nonetheless, survivors from the Irish joined the party in great numbers, radicalized its program, and took control of its leadership. On January 21st, 1919, 27 newly elected members of Sinn Féin assembled in Dublin and established the Dáil Éireann, or the Assembly of Ireland. They proclaimed the establishment of an Irish Republic, and the Irish Volunteers became known as the Irish Republican Army, or the infamous IRA. The Dáil's newly elected president, Éamon de Valera, favored a more conventional form of war, but he was not necessarily in control of the IRA. Instead, Michael Collins took the reins of the militant side of the war. Collins was a mastermind of militant violence, and was in favor of a more active form of war. Others preferred a campaign of civil disobedience. For more than the first half of the war, this was a reality. Hardly any violence broke out across the country. British journalist Robert Lind wrote in July 1920 that their policy is not so much to attack the government, but as to ignore it and to build up a new government by its side. But in late 1920, the war began to escalate. After raising over $5 million from the Irish Americans in the United States, de Valera was able to give Collins the money needed to provide funds and arms to the IRA units that needed them. On November 21st, 1920, Collins' IRA squad attempted to wipe out the British intelligence operatives in Dublin. The squad shot 19 people, killing 14 and wounding 5. In response, British forces drove in trucks into Croke Park during a football match, shooting into the crowd. 14 civilians were killed and 65 people were wounded. Later that day, 2 Republican prisoners were killed in Dublin Castle. This day forever became known as Bloody Sunday. These attacks marked an escalation in the violence of the war. Over 1,000 people were killed between the months of January and July alone. On March 19, 1921, a group of 100 West Cork IRA soldiers fought against 1,200 British troops in the Crossbarry ambush. The IRA soldiers narrowly avoided being trapped and instead killed 30 men on the British side. Just 2 days later, on March 21st, the County Kerry IRA attacked a train at the Headford Junction, near Killarney. 20 British soldiers were killed or injured, as well as 2 IRA men and 3 civilians. In the spring and early summer of 1921, as the Irish began to run low on weapons and ammunition, the war became what many historians call the Propaganda War. The British attempted to portray the IRA as anti-Protestant in order to encourage loyalism in Irish Protestants and win sympathy for their harsh tactics back in Britain. They encouraged newspaper editors, forcefully at times, to make it seem as though the IRA was slaughtering innocent Protestants. Although Britain's campaign to smear the image of the IRA may have worked in Britain, it did little to affect the people of Ireland. Sinn Féin's propaganda campaign, on the other hand, did remove the British administration's desire to intensify the conflict. The British cabinet was not pleased with the way the war had developed since 1919. The conflict had reached a stalemate. From the point of view of the British government, it appeared as if the IRA's guerrilla warfare tactics would continue indefinitely, resulting in large losses of money and wasted time. On the other side, IRA leaders, including Michael Collins, felt that they had been hard-pressed by the development of more British soldiers to Ireland and by the lack of arms and ammunition. On June 24, 1921, the British decided to propose talks with the leaders of Sinn Féin. De Valera and David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, ultimately agreed to a truce that was intended to end the fighting and lay the ground for further negotiations. The peace talks led to the negotiation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on December 6, 1921. Part of the treaty reads as follows: Ireland shall have the same constitutional status in the community of nations known as the British Empire, and shall be styled and known as the Irish Free State. Most of the revolution's leaders were willing to accept the compromise, though many militant Republicans were not. A group of IRA members who had fought in the War of Independence, led by Liam Lynch, refused to accept the treaty, and in March 1922 denounced the authority of the Dáil and a new government. The debates that followed eventually led to the Irish Civil War, which was fought between the newly formed Irish Free State and the opponents of the treaty and their supporters. The results of this civil war, however, do little in explaining the overall significance of the Irish Revolution. To begin with, the enthusiasm and passion that the Irish fought with represented the nationalism that had consumed the entire world. Larger countries like Germany, France, and Austria had started to become fixated with the idea of fighting for one's country and serving the interests of the nation alone. By the time the 20th century rolled around, nationalism had taken hold of all of Europe, and it was ready to take hold of Ireland. In Britain, things seemed to go differently from the rest of Europe. Britain's government began to implement the ideas of the social gospel and utilitarianism into the country. By doing so, the mighty British Empire had constructed a way of fostering nationalism without the rebellions and uprisings. By the turn of the 20th century, however, fears had begun to grow in Britain that it would no longer be able to defend the vast expense of its colonies and the entirety of the empire, while at the same time maintaining their policy of splendid isolation. At the same time, the separate spheres of nationalism in Europe came to a clash in the First World War. Now that war had consumed the itinerary of the mighty British Empire, the leaders of the country knew that some sacrifices needed to be made. The British had begun to realize that they may have in fact squeezed Ireland for all the Jews it had. With nothing left to fight for, it seemed easy for the mighty empire to slack off and deal with the revolution later. More than a small colony lost to nationalism, the Irish War of Independence served as more of a symbol of what Europe had come to at the dawn of the 20th century. Nationalism had come to dominate the face of all of Europe, and it would continue to do so for several future generations. Also, the mighty British Empire had come to the end of its Pax Britannica, and instead entered into a period of slowly losing hold of all of its former colonies. After generations of struggling and fighting against the odds, the people of Ireland had finally found a way to unite with each other under one cause. Although debates surrounding the Anglo-Irish Treaty continued for several decades to come, the small country that had always been pushed around by larger empires had finally become one. Through acts of passion and courageousness, Ireland had at last become a land filled with people ready to defend the country that they had fought so hard for.